I asked Claire Hayes to dance because the bride's mother kept glaring at the two empty chairs at our table, and somewhere between the second verse and the bridge, dancing with my neighbor stopped being a favor to anyone but myself. We'd ended up at the same table by accident, table 11, the overflow table for guests who knew the bride and groom through circumstances too minor to warrant seating near the head table. I knew them through the neighborhood association, the kind of casual friendship that gets you invited to weddings but not asked to be in the wedding party. Claire knew them through her firm, having done some renovation work on their first apartment years before either of us had moved to the same street. We'd talked casually at the cocktail hour, the easy small talk of two people who'd nodded at each other in the driveway a few times, but never had an actual conversation. She'd moved into the house 3 doors down from mine about 4 months earlier, an architect with a firm downtown, the kind of woman who noticed building details most people walked past without registering. "That cornice work is original," she'd said, gesturing at the venue's ceiling, completely unprompted during the cocktail hour. "Most places like this have replaced it with reproduction trim by now. Someone's maintained this building carefully." "I genuinely don't know what a cornice is," I'd admitted. "The decorative molding where the wall meets the ceiling. I notice these things. It's an occupational hazard. I teach history. I notice when dates don't add up in textbooks. We all have our hazards." She'd laughed, the easy kind, and the conversation had continued from there through the appetizers and into the dinner. Easier than either of us had probably expected from a wedding seating arrangement neither of us controlled. We'd talked about the neighborhood, comparing notes on which houses had the best gardens and which neighbors organized the most unnecessary HOA complaints, the specific shared context that develops between people who live near each other without actually knowing each other. "You're the history teacher," she said partway through the appetizers. "I've heard about you. Apparently you give a memorable lecture about the founding fathers that half the neighborhood's teenagers still quote at dinner. That's mortifying and also accurate. I didn't realize my classroom material had achieved neighborhood-wide circulation. Small towns, word travels. I've heard good things for what it's worth. The Henderson's kid said you're the only teacher who made history feel like an actual story instead of a list of dates to memorize." "That's generous. I mostly just try to make Andrew Jackson sound as genuinely unhinged as he actually was. The truth does most of the work." She laughed at that, and somewhere in the exchange, the careful politeness of two strangers who happened to live on the same street started shifting into something that felt more like an actual conversation between two people who found each other interesting. "What made you become an architect?" I asked during the salad course. "I liked buildings that told you something true about the people inside them, even before you met anyone. My grandfather was a contractor. I used to go to job sites with him as a kid, and I think I just never stopped being curious about how spaces shape the people living in them." She considered her answer for a moment. "Also, I'm told I have an unreasonably strong opinion about cornice work, which probably should have been my first clue about the career path." "I noticed that opinion. It was the first thing you said to me tonight. I have priorities. Architectural integrity comes before small talk." The conversation continued through dinner, easier than either of us had probably expected from a wedding seating arrangement neither of us controlled. The MC made the announcement around 9, all couples to the dance floor for a slow song, the bride's specific request apparently, something about wanting everyone paired up for at least one song before the real dancing started. Our table looked around at each other, the specific awkwardness of several unaccompanied guests realizing the instruction didn't quite apply to anyone present. "We could just sit this one out," Claire said. "Pretend we didn't hear the announcement." I looked at the bride's mother, 3 tables over, scanning the room with the specific protective intensity of someone determined to make her daughter's wedding go exactly according to plan, her eyes landing on our conspicuously seated table. "I think she's noticed the empty dance floor real estate at our table specifically," I said. Claire followed my gaze, saw the mother's expression, and exhaled something between a laugh and a groan. "Of course she has. Okay. Practical solution." "Practical solution," I agreed. "One dance, for the sake of the seating chart and a woman who's clearly invested significant emotional energy into this wedding going perfectly." That's a generous read of her expression. I'd describe it as slightly terrifying, but sure, let's go with invested. We stood up together, and I held out my hand with the specific formality of someone executing a practical solution rather than asking someone he found interesting to dance. And she took it with the same performed casualness, and we walked onto the dance floor among several other couples who'd all clearly received the same instruction from the bride. My name is Grant Sullivan. I'm 33 years old. I teach American history at the local high school, the kind of job that doesn't pay particularly well, but that I've never seriously considered leaving, because there's something genuinely satisfying about watching a 16-year-old understand, for the first time, why some decision made 200 years ago still shapes the argument they're having with their parents today. I've lived on Maple Street for 6 years, in a house I bought right after finishing my master's degree, settled into the specific routine of someone who liked his neighborhood and had stopped actively looking for anything to disrupt it. Claire Hayes had moved into the house 3 doors down in early spring, and what I knew about her before that wedding amounted to: she ran most mornings, she had excellent taste in porch furniture, and she'd waved at me exactly 4 times across our shared street without either of us initiating actual conversation. The song playing when we reached the dance floor was something slow and a little old-fashioned, the kind of choice that suggested the bride had genuine taste, rather than just following wedding playlist convention. Claire settled into the dance with the specific competence of someone who'd actually learned to dance properly at some point, rather than just shuffling in place the way most people do at wedding. "You actually know how to do this," I observed, adjusting my own significantly less practiced movement to follow her lead. My mother insisted on lessons growing up. I resented it intensely at age 12. I'm grateful now, in specific situations exactly like this one. I'm the opposite. I'm making this up entirely as I go. "You're doing fine. Slightly stiff, but fine." High praise. She laughed again, that easy, unguarded sound, and something about the specific ordinary pleasure of the moment, good music, decent company, the low stakes of a dance neither of us had particularly sought out, made the 3 minutes pass faster than I'd expected. Near the end of the song, the lighting shifted slightly, the venue's staff dimming things further for the transition into the next number, and for a moment we were closer than the formal dance position strictly required, close enough that I could see the specific attention in her expression, the way she was looking at me like she was reconsidering an initial assessment in real time. The song ended. We stepped back, the formal distance returning, but something in the air between us had shifted in ways neither of us immediately addressed. "Well," Claire said, "mission accomplished. The bride's mother can stand down." "Mission accomplished," I agreed. We walked back toward our table, and it was only when we were seated again that she leaned slightly toward me and said, quietly with a specific dry amusement underneath the words, "Everyone saw you choose me, you know, for the dance. Out of everyone at that table who could have been your practical solution, you were the only other unaccompanied person at the table. Marcus from the catering staff was also unaccompanied. You didn't ask him." I looked at her, caught slightly off guard by the accuracy of the observation. "That's a fair point. I suppose I did choose you specifically. I'm just saying, people noticed my aunt 3 tables over gave me a very particular look during the second verse." Claire picked up her wine glass, the corner of her mouth suggesting she found the whole situation more entertaining than concerning. "Just thought you should know what you started." I didn't think much more about the comment that night, filed it away as wedding banter, the kind of thing people say at receptions that doesn't necessarily carry weight beyond the evening itself. But I noticed, over the following weeks, that I'd started paying more attention to the house 3 doors down than I had before. Whether her car was in the driveway, whether her porch light was on. The specific habit of awareness that develops when someone has shifted, without explicit reason, from background neighbor to person you're tracking, without fully admitting why. We ran into each other at the mailboxes about 2 weeks later, both of us collecting mail at the same time for what was probably the first instance of actual coincidence rather than wedding-imposed proximity. "Grant," she said, the easy recognition of someone who'd already filed me under acquaintance rather than stranger. "Claire, how's the architecture business?" Demanding. There's a client who wants their entire kitchen redesigned around an island that physically cannot fit the space they have, and explaining basic geometry to someone paying me a lot of money is somehow the hardest part of my job. She shuffled through her mail. How's history? Static mostly. The past doesn't change much week to week. That must be restful. It has its moments. Mostly I just argue with 16-year-olds about whether historical figures were good or bad people, which turns out to be considerably more contentious than you'd expect. She laughed, and the conversation extended longer than mailbox conversations typically do, the specific lingering that happens when neither person is actively trying to end an exchange. How's the kitchen island negotiation going? I asked. The one defying basic geometry. Ongoing. I drew them 3 alternative layouts. They rejected all 3 on aesthetic grounds, despite each one being more structurally sound than their original vision. I'm currently drafting a 4th option, mostly out of professional stubbornness at this point. That sounds exhausting. It is. But also satisfying, in a strange way. I like the puzzle of it, even when the client makes the puzzle harder than it needs to be. She shifted her mail to one arm. What about your 16-year-olds? Still debating historical morality? We've moved on to debating whether Alexander Hamilton was a hero or a cautionary tale. The class is fairly evenly split, which I think says something about how complicated actual history is compared to the simplified version most textbooks prefer. I'd probably side with cautionary tale for what it's worth. Most people do, once they actually read the full story instead of the musical. She smiled at that, and we stood there at the mailboxes longer than the actual mail collection required, the conversation extending into the specific, comfortable territory of 2 people who'd discovered, somewhat to their own surprise, that they enjoyed talking to each other. I've been meaning to ask, she said eventually. Has everyone saw you choose me been haunting you since the wedding, or did you successfully forget I said that? I haven't forgotten. I've been deciding what to do with the information. And what have you decided? I considered the question honestly, standing at the mailboxes with letters in my hand and a neighbor I'd started noticing more than background noise. I think I'd like to take you to dinner, I said. Not because anyone's watching this time, just because I'd like to. Claire looked at me for a moment, something shifting in her expression. Not quite surprise, more like the specific satisfaction of an outcome she'd been mildly hoping for without fully admitting it. I'd like that, she said. Saturday? Saturday. The first dinner happened at a small bistro downtown, neutral ground neither of us had particularly strong associations with. The kind of careful choice 2 people make when they're aware a first dinner might mean something, but aren't ready to treat it like it definitely does. This feels different from the mailbox conversations, Claire observed partway through the appetizers. More deliberate. It is more deliberate. I asked you out on purpose this time, not because a bride's mother was glaring at us. I noticed the absence of glaring mothers. It's a nice change of pace. She studied the menu, then looked up. Can I ask you something slightly forward? Go ahead. Why now? We've lived 3 doors apart for 4 months. You could have asked me to dinner any time before the wedding forced our hand. What made this the moment? I considered the question honestly, because it deserved more than a deflecting joke. Honestly? I don't think I'd actually noticed you. Not really, before that wedding. We waved. We existed in the same general vicinity. But something about an actual conversation, even one forced by a seating chart, made me notice things I hadn't bothered noticing before. The way you talk about buildings like they have feelings. The specific way you laugh when something genuinely catches you off guard. That's a more thoughtful answer than I expected. I've had a few weeks to think about it. I'm a teacher. I overthink most things eventually. She smiled at that, and the conversation continued through the rest of dinner with the specific ease of 2 people who'd already established, somewhat accidentally, that they enjoyed each other's company. The dinner went well enough that it became a pattern, not officially dating, not yet, but the specific accumulation of evenings that develops when 2 people keep finding reasons to see each other beyond the original excuse. We talked about her work, the buildings she'd designed and the clients who fought her on basic structural realities. I told her about teaching, the specific satisfaction and exhaustion of trying to make the past feel relevant to people who were mostly thinking about lunch and their phones. She mentioned the song from the wedding on our third dinner, almost as an aside. "I looked it up," she said, "the song we danced to. I didn't recognize it at the time, but it stuck with me enough that I went searching." "What did you find?" "It's actually a fairly obscure cover of an older song. The bride apparently chose it specifically because it was her grandparents' wedding song originally. There's a whole sentimental backstory I read about in some wedding blog she apparently contributed to. That's a lot of research for a song you only heard once." "I told you. I noticed details. Occupational hazard extended to romantic curiosity, apparently." She looked slightly self-conscious admitting this. "I've played it a few times since. It's a good song independent of the context." "Send it to me," I said. "I'd like to have it too." She did, that evening, a simple text with just the song title and no further comment, and I played it that night sitting on my own porch, looking down the street toward the house 3 doors down, thinking about a wedding and a dance and a comment that had apparently started something neither of us had fully named yet. On our 4th dinner, the conversation turned more serious than the previous ones had been. The specific shift that happens when 2 people stop performing their best selves and start showing the more complicated parts. "Can I tell you something that might change how you see me slightly?" Claire asked partway through dinner, her tone more careful than usual. "Of course. I've been divorced 3 years ago now. It wasn't dramatic, particularly. We just wanted different things the way these stories usually go. But it made me cautious about how quickly I let myself get attached to something new. I've dated a little since then, but nothing that felt like more than filling time." She looked at me directly. "This feels like more than filling time." That scares me slightly, if I'm being honest. I appreciated the vulnerability of the admission, the specific courage it took to say something like that out loud to someone she'd only known a few weeks in this new context. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I don't think it changes how I see you. If anything, it explains some of the careful pacing I've noticed from you, which I'd assumed was just personality but apparently has more history behind it. A little of both, probably. I am naturally careful. The divorce just gave the carefulness a specific reason to exist." "I haven't been married," I offered, in the spirit of matching her honesty. "But I dated someone for 4 years in my late 20s who ultimately decided she wanted a different kind of life than the one I was building here. It wasn't dramatic either, just incompatible eventually. I think I've been similarly cautious since then, just less aware of it until you pointed out the parallel." Claire looked at me with something like relief, the specific comfort of discovering shared history rather than feeling alone in her caution. "So we're both careful people who somehow ended up at the same overflow wedding table," she said. "Apparently, I'm choosing to find that more reassuring than coincidental." "Me too," she said. "I think I needed to say the divorce thing out loud before this went any further, just so you knew what you were actually getting into. I appreciate knowing. It doesn't change anything for me, except maybe making me more certain this is worth being patient about." She smiled at that, something settling in her expression that suggested the vulnerability had been worth the risk. A few weeks into the pattern of dinners, Claire started joining me on my porch some evenings, the specific, comfortable habit that develops when 2 people stop needing a formal excuse to spend time together. "I like your porch better than mine," she admitted, one September evening, settling into the chair beside mine with a cup of tea she'd brought from her own kitchen. "Better angle on the sunset. I've always thought so too. It's part of why I bought this particular house, actually. The realtor probably thought I was strange for caring so much about porch orientation. I would have thought the same thing, professionally, though now I respect the choice. It shows good instincts about how a space should actually be used." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the street do what residential streets do in early evening. Someone walking a dog, kids riding bikes before the streetlights came on, the specific, unremarkable piece of a neighborhood settling into its evening rhythm. "Can I tell you something?" Claire said eventually. "Of course. I almost didn't go to that wedding. I'd RSVP'd months earlier when the invitation felt obligatory, and by the time the date actually arrived, I'd half-talked myself into claiming a work emergency instead." She looked at her tea. "I'm glad I didn't, obviously. But it's strange to think about how close I came to skipping the exact night that led to this. I think about that too sometimes, how much of this depended on neither of us backing out of an obligation we didn't particularly want to attend. Fate, or just statistics catching up eventually. I'm not sure which explanation I prefer. I think I prefer fate. It sounds more interesting at parties. She laughed, and we sat there until the sky had fully darkened, neither of us in any particular hurry to end the evening. The tension arrived without warning, the way it usually does, on an ordinary Wednesday about a week before Jake's barbecue. Claire texted asking if I was free that evening, her tone slightly different than usual. Not alarming exactly, but careful in a way that made me brace for something before I knew what it was. She was sitting on my porch steps when I got home. Not inside the way she usually let herself be by then, and something about the choice of location, more formal than our usual evenings, told me this was a conversation rather than a casual visit. My firm offered me a project, she said without much preamble. A significant one, a whole redevelopment, the kind of career-defining work that doesn't come along often. It's in Denver, 8 months, possibly longer if it extends the way these things sometimes do. I felt something drop in my chest, sharper than I'd expected given how new this still technically was. When would you need to decide? End of the week. They need an answer fast because of the project timeline. What are you thinking? She looked at her hands, the specific hesitation of someone who hadn't fully decided yet and was working through it partly out loud. 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately. No question. This is exactly the kind of project I've been building my career toward. She glanced at me. Now I'm sitting on your porch instead of drafting an acceptance email, which probably tells you something about how complicated this has actually become. I don't want to be the reason you turn down something that matters to your career, I said, meaning it even as the words cost me something to say. I know. That's exactly the problem. If this were 6 months ago, turning it down for a relationship would have felt like exactly the kind of compromise I promised myself after the divorce I'd never make again. But it's not 6 months ago. And I don't actually know what the right answer is, which is unusual for me. I'm not someone who struggles with decisions usually. We sat in silence for a while, the specific quiet of 2 people, each waiting to see if the other would say the thing that would make the decision easier. Neither of us quite willing to be the one who asked outright. I'm not going to tell you what to choose, I said finally. That's not fair to either of us, but I will tell you that I'd miss you considerably more than I expected to, given how recently this started. That's the honest information I have to offer. That's not nothing, Claire said quietly. It's not everything either. You have to make the choice that's right for you, not the choice that keeps things easy for me. She didn't decide that night. She told me 2 days later that she'd turned the project down, not because of me explicitly, she clarified carefully, but because something about the specific timing had made her realize she wasn't actually ready to leave a life that had just started feeling like it mattered in a new way. The firm had been disappointed but understanding, and another project, smaller but still meaningful, had come up within the week to fill the gap. I don't want you to think I gave something up because of you, she said, the day she told me her decision. I made a choice for myself. You were a factor, but not the only one. I believe you, I said. I'm also relieved, if I'm being honest. More relieved than I probably should admit so soon. I'll allow the admission. I was relieved, too, once I'd actually decided. That conversation sat with both of us differently than anything before it had. The first real evidence that what we'd been building had genuine stakes attached. The kind that could have gone differently if either of us had made a different choice that week. Jake Morrison, who lived 2 houses up from me and had appointed himself the unofficial mayor of Maple Street's social calendar, hosted the neighborhood's end-of-summer barbecue in his backyard, the kind of event where most of the street showed up and conversations happened in shifting clusters around the grill and the cooler. Claire and I had arrived separately, by then several weeks into whatever this had become, careful about not making it too obvious in front of the neighbors while also not actively hiding it. The specific balance of 2 people figuring out a relationship's public visibility at their own pace. Jake, apparently, had been paying closer attention than either of us had accounted for. The barbecue itself had been pleasant enough up to that point. burgers, the specific chaos of several neighborhood dogs competing for scraps, conversations rotating through clusters of people who'd known each other for years through the simple accident of shared geography. I'd introduced Claire to a few more neighbors throughout the afternoon, the easy, casual introductions of someone bringing a person they were seeing to a social event, without making a formal announcement out of it. Carol, Jake's wife, had pulled Claire aside at one point to discuss porch furniture recommendations, the two of them disappearing into a 20-minute conversation about wicker versus metal that left me standing near the dessert table making small talk with someone's teenage son about a history project. It was after that conversation, once Claire had rejoined me near the cooler, that Jake made his move. He cornered both of us near the cooler, beer in hand, with the specific directness of someone who'd clearly been waiting for the right moment to ask a question he'd been forming for weeks. "Okay," he said. "I need to know what's actually happening here. The two of you. Don't give me the neighbor acquaintance answer, because I've seen you arrive together twice now and leave together once. And I'm not blind." Claire and I exchanged a glance, the specific look of two people who hadn't discussed how to answer this exact question in public yet. "We've been seeing each other," I said. "Since the wedding, more or less." "Since the wedding," Jake repeated, looking between us with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had just been confirmed. "I knew it. I told Carol I knew it. The way you two danced, that wasn't a courtesy dance. That was a choosing each other dance. And everyone at that reception clocked it immediately." "Apparently that's the consensus assessment," Claire said dryly. "I made the same observation that night, for the record." "So what is this actually?" Jake pressed. "Dating? Serious? Should I be planning for a second wedding on this street within the year because frankly the neighborhood could use the excitement?" "Jake," I said, "we've been together a few weeks. Let's not skip several stages of a relationship in one backyard conversation. I'm just asking the question everyone's been wondering. You can't blame me for asking it directly instead of speculating behind your backs like everyone else has been doing." Claire looked at him, something working behind her expression that settled eventually into amused exasperation rather than annoyance. "We're figuring it out," she said. "Honestly, Jake, we like each other. We're taking it at a reasonable pace instead of rushing into labels because a neighborhood barbecue demands clarity." "Fair enough. I'll allow reasonable pacing." Jake raised his beer slightly. "But for the record, I'm taking partial credit if this works out. The wedding seating chart that put you two at the same table was practically matchmaking, even if nobody officially intended it that way." He wandered off toward the grill, satisfied with having extracted at least partial confirmation, leaving Claire and me standing near the cooler with the specific awkwardness of having just had our private developing relationship made semi-public by a well-meaning but blunt neighbor. "That was invasive." Claire said, once Jake was out of earshot. "Extremely, also accurate, which is somehow worse. Are we figuring it out? Honestly, not just for Jake's benefit." I looked at her, considering the question seriously, rather than deflecting with the easy humor we'd been using to manage Jake's interrogation. "I think we are," I said. "I think I've been more sure about this for longer than I've said directly. I just didn't want to rush something that started so casually into something with more weight than either of us had agreed to yet." "That's reasonable. I've been doing the same calculation, honestly." Claire studied me for a moment. "Can I ask you something Jake's interrogation interrupted before I got to actually answer it?" "Go ahead. Do you want this to be serious? Not in a Jake demands an answer way, in an actual, honest way." I thought about a wedding dance and a song we'd both started playing independently, and weeks of dinners that had stopped feeling like dates and started feeling like simply how my evenings worked now. "Yes," I said, "I want this to be serious. I've wanted that for a few weeks now. I think I was just waiting for the right moment to say so without it feeling forced by circumstance." Jake forced the circumstance, technically. Jake forced the circumstance. I'm choosing to be grateful about that instead of annoyed. Claire smiled, the real one, unguarded in the way that had become increasingly familiar over the past several weeks. "I want this to be serious too," she said, "for what it's worth. I've wanted that since approximately the second verse of that song at the wedding, if I'm being fully honest. That's earlier than I expected." I told you, I notice details. I noticed that one fairly quickly. We stayed at the barbecue another hour, the conversation with Jake having shifted something between us into a more settled certainty than we'd had walking in. Carol caught my eye at one point across the yard and gave me a small, knowing nod, the specific neighborhood version of approval that meant the street had collectively decided this was a good development. Driving home that evening, Claire in the passenger seat of my car since we'd carpooled for once instead of arriving separately, she looked over at me with the particular thoughtfulness she brought to most observations. "Jake's going to tell the entire street by Monday," she said. "You know that." "I'm aware. I've made peace with it." "Does it bother you, being neighborhood news?" I considered the question seriously. "No, actually. I think I like that this isn't something we have to hide or manage carefully. It just is what it is, and the street gets to know about it the way the street knows about most things eventually. That's a healthier attitude than I expected from someone who initially wanted to take this slowly. I still want to take it at a reasonable pace. I just don't mind people knowing the pace exists." She smiled at that, looking out the window at the familiar streets passing by. Streets that had become considerably more interesting to both of us since a wedding several months earlier had rearranged something neither of us had anticipated. I went to her house on a Friday evening in October, several weeks after the barbecue, with a specific plan that I'd been considering since the conversation Jake had inadvertently forced into the open. She opened the door, surprised by the visit since we hadn't explicitly planned anything that evening. "I didn't know you were coming by," she said. "I wasn't planning to. I had an idea and didn't want to wait until tomorrow to act on it." That sounds either very romantic or slightly concerning. Which is it? Romantic? I promise. I held up my phone, the song already cued. "Can I come in?" She stepped back to let me through, curiosity replacing the initial surprise, and I set my phone on her kitchen counter, the song starting quietly. The same slow, slightly old-fashioned melody from the wedding reception months earlier. "You're not serious," she said, recognizing it immediately. "Completely serious." I held out my hand, the same formal gesture from the dance floor that night, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "Dance with me." "There's no wedding happening right now, Grant. No bride's mother glaring at empty chairs forcing this." "I know, that's sort of the point." I kept my hand extended. "I wanted to ask you to dance when nobody was making either of us do it. When it was just actually about wanting to, not about managing a seating chart or a watchful mother of the bride." She looked at my hand, then at my face, the specific, careful assessment she brought to most decisions that mattered. "This feels significant," she said. "More significant than a kitchen dance probably should feel." "It is significant." That's why I drove over here instead of waiting until our next scheduled dinner to mention it. I wanted this to happen on its own, outside of any context except wanting to dance with you specifically. "You've been thinking about this since the barbecue." Since the barbecue, and honestly, probably since the actual wedding, if I'm being fully accurate about the timeline. Claire looked at my outstretched hand for a long moment, something soft moving across her expression, and then she took it, stepping into the same dance position from months earlier, except this time in her own kitchen, with no audience, no social obligation, just the two of us, and a song that had quietly become the soundtrack to however many weeks of falling into something neither of us had expected from an overflow wedding table. "This is considerably less practiced than the wedding version," I admitted, as we moved slowly around her kitchen. "You've had months to improve." I'm slightly disappointed in the lack of progress. I've been focusing on other relationship skills. Dancing fell down the priority list. Fair trade, I suppose. We moved through the song slowly, no formal distance required this time, close enough that I could feel her breathing settle into the same rhythm as mine. And near the end, as the final chorus faded toward its quiet conclusion, she looked up at me with the specific clarity of someone who'd already decided something and was simply confirming it out loud. "Everyone saw you choose me that night," she whispered, "but I think I chose you too. I just didn't fully admit that to myself until right now, dancing in my kitchen with no audience required. I think I chose you the same night. I just took longer to say so. You always take longer to say things. I've noticed that about you. It's either a teacher's caution or just your particular brand of carefulness. Probably both. The song ended. Neither of us stepped back this time. The formal distance from the wedding entirely absent. Just two people standing in a quiet kitchen having finally said, plainly, what a dance floor and a watchful mother of the bride had started months before either of us was ready to name it. Jake found out about the kitchen dance approximately a week later, the way Jake found out about most things eventually, and made sure to mention it the next time he saw us together at the mailboxes. I heard about the private dance recital, he said, with the specific satisfaction of someone who considered himself vindicated by recent developments. Carol said Claire told her about it. Very romantic, apparently. We're not discussing the details with you, Jake, Claire said, though she was smiling when she said it. I don't need details, I just need credit. I forced that barbecue conversation, and look what happened a week later. I'm basically a relationship consultant at this point. You're a neighbor who asked an invasive question at a backyard party, I said. An invasive question that apparently accelerated something that was clearly already happening. I'm allowed to take some credit for catalyzing the inevitable. Claire and I exchanged a glance, the specific shared amusement of two people who'd learned to find Jake's interference more endearing than annoying over the past several months. Fine, I said. Partial credit, very partial. I'll take partial credit. I'm a reasonable man. Jake collected his own mail, satisfied with the negotiated outcome. Carol wants to know if you're coming to Thanksgiving, by the way. Both of you, as a unit apparently, since that's clearly what you are now. We'll be there, Claire said before I could even formulate a response. The easy confidence of someone who'd stopped hesitating about what this had become. Jake wandered off toward his house, leaving us standing at the mailboxes the same way we had months earlier, except everything about the moment felt entirely different now. No longer two near strangers making polite small talk, but two people who'd built something real out of an accidental wedding seating chart and a song that had become unmistakably theirs. Thanksgiving at Jake and Carol's was loud and crowded, half the street packed into their dining room and overflow seating extending into the living room, and at some point during dessert, the couple whose wedding had started all of this, Daniel and Mara, the original bride and groom, showed up as last-minute additions to Jake's guest list, having apparently been invited weeks earlier without my full awareness. Mara found us near the dessert table, recognizing Claire immediately from the wedding months earlier. You too, she said, with the specific delight of someone connecting dots she hadn't previously had reason to connect. Jake mentioned something was happening, but I didn't realize it traced back to my actual wedding. Table 11, Claire said. The overflow table. Apparently it did more matchmaking than anyone intended. That's incredible. I specifically remember asking the venue coordinator to make sure no tables felt left out, and I had no idea it would result in an actual relationship forming. Mara looked between us with genuine warmth. I'm so glad. Truly. That dance floor moment, my mother mentioned it to me that same night, actually. She said something about a couple at the overflow table dancing like they meant it. Your mother sharp eyes. She does. She's been right about several things over the years, much to my occasional annoyance. Mara laughed. I'm glad something good came out of forcing everyone onto the dance floor for that one song. I wasn't sure anyone would actually appreciate the gesture. We appreciated it, Claire said, glancing at me, more than either of us probably let on at the time. Mara moved on to greet other guests, leaving us standing near the dessert table with the specific warmth of having the origin story of this entire relationship acknowledged by the people who'd unknowingly started it. It's strange, I said once Mara had moved off, thinking about how many small accidents had to align for any of this to happen. The wedding invitation, the seating chart, the bride's specific song choice, Jake's nosiness. All accidents, Claire agreed, or all the specific kind of fate that just looks like accidents until you trace the whole pattern backward. I think I prefer that explanation. It sounds better at parties, like I mentioned before. It does sound better at parties, she agreed, taking my hand as we made our way back toward the rest of the gathering, the specific ease of two people who'd stopped needing any external reason to want to be near each other. What would you have done if a wedding seating chart accidentally put you next to someone who'd quietly become the best part of your week, and a single forced dance turned out to be the beginning of choosing each other on purpose? Have you ever realized that something everyone else saw clearly before you did was actually the truest thing happening in your life? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.